The silence of space was broken by a single, desperate transmission that would change the course of galactic history forever. Deep in the Outer Rim territories, where civilized species rarely ventured, a small research vessel, called the Times Gentle Current Times, drifted helplessly through the void. Its crew of 12 Altarian scientists had been studying ancient stellar formations when their worst nightmare became reality. Captain Zephys pressed her four-fingered hand against the communication console, her blue-scaled face twisted with fear. The ship's hull groaned under the stress of repeated impacts from the Void Hunter's plasma cannons. These were the monsters that haunted every spacefarer's dreams, a nomadic species of raiders who consumed other civilizations for sport and sustenance. "Send the distress signal on all frequencies," Zephys commanded her communications officer. "Someone has to hear us." The young Altarian's hands trembled as he activated the broad-spectrum emergency beacon. "Captain, we're in unclaimed space. The nearest Galactic Council patrol is 3 days away. Even if they receive our signal, we'll be dead long before help arrives." Through the viewport, Zephys could see the massive Void Hunter ships surrounding them like predators circling wounded prey. Their vessels were nightmares of twisted metal and organic growths, pulsing with an evil bioluminescence that made her stomach turn. She had heard the stories. The Void Hunters didn't just kill their victims. They absorbed them, adding their knowledge and biological distinctiveness to their own twisted collective. "Keep transmitting," she said quietly. "If we're going to die here, at least let our deaths serve as a warning to others." The distress signal pulsed outward through space, carrying with it the coordinates of their position and a desperate plea for help. It traveled through the vast emptiness between stars, reaching the communication arrays of a dozen different species. Most who received it simply marked the location as a danger zone and continued about their business. The Void Hunters were a force of nature, like a cosmic hurricane. You didn't fight them, you simply tried to stay out of their way. But there was one species that heard the signal differently. Admiral Sarah Chen stood in the command center of the Times UES Defiant Asterisk, humanity's newest and most advanced battlecruiser. She was reviewing supply reports when Lieutenant Morrison burst through the doors, his face flushed with excitement and concern. "Admiral, we've received a distress signal from the Outer Rim. Unknown alien vessel under attack by hostiles." Sarah looked up from her datapad, her dark eyes sharp with interest. "How far out?" 18 hours at maximum burn, ma'am. "But Admiral, the attackers. The signal indicates they're Void Hunters." A hush fell over the command center. Even among humans, who were relative newcomers to galactic politics, the reputation of the Void Hunters was well known. They were the boogeymen of the galaxy, an unstoppable force that had been terrorizing the outer systems for over 1,000 years. "What's our current mission status?" Sarah asked. "We're returning to Earth after the diplomatic mission to Proxima Station. No urgent obligations, but Admiral, no one fights the Void Hunters. Even the Galactic Council's military forces avoid direct confrontation with them." Sarah stared at the tactical display showing their current position relative to the distress signal. She thought about her grandfather, who had fought in Earth's last great war before humanity discovered faster-than-light travel. He had taught her that evil triumphed when good people chose to do nothing. "Lieutenant Morrison, send a message to Earth Command. Inform them that we're responding to a distress signal and may be delayed in our return. Ma'am, with respect, the Void Hunters have ships that make our best vessels look like toys. They've been raiding and pillaging for millennia. What can one human ship do against them?" Sarah smiled grimly. "We're about to find out. Set course for those coordinates. Maximum burn." As the Times Defiant Times changed course and accelerated toward the Outer Rim, its quantum communication array sent out a different kind of signal. This one was coded on frequencies that only human vessels could receive. It carried Sarah's identification codes and a simple message. "Pack formation. Condition: red. All available units respond." Across human space, the message was received and understood. The merchant vessel Times Iron Will Times changed course from its cargo run to the Centauri colonies. The exploration ship Times Pioneer Spirit Times abandoned its survey mission in the Vega system. The heavy cruiser Times Unconquered Times broke off from its patrol along the Terran border. Within hours, dozens of human ships had received the signal and were converging on the coordinates. This was something uniquely human. The pack mentality that had helped their species survive on a death world called Earth. When one human called for help, others came running, regardless of the odds. Back aboard the Time's gentle current asterisk, Captain Zephys watched helplessly as the Void Hunters prepared to board her ship. Their boarding pods were already attaching to her hull with sickening wet sounds. She could hear the screams of her crew members as the raiders cut through the outer bulkheads. "Captain!" her communications officer called out desperately. "I'm receiving a response to our distress signal." Zephys felt a spark of hope. "The Galactic Council?" "No, ma'am. It's from a species called humans. They say they're 18 hours out and closing fast." The hope died as quickly as it had come. 18 hours might as well have been 18 years. The Void Hunters would have finished with them in minutes. Not hours. "Send our gratitude," Zephys said softly. Tell them to remember us." The boarding pods finally breached the hull, and nightmare creatures poured into the ship. The Void Hunters stood nearly 3 meters tall. With elongated limbs that ended in razor-sharp claws, their faces were hidden behind masks of twisted bone and metal, and their movements were accompanied by a sound like grinding machinery mixed with animal snarls. But as the raiders advanced through the ship, something unexpected happened. More signals began appearing on the communications array. First one, then dozens, then hundreds. All human ships, all converging on their position. The lead Void Hunter, a massive creature designated as a war form by its collective, paused in its advance. Through its neural link with the ship's sensors, it detected the approaching fleet. At first, it felt amusement. What could a few primitive vessels do against the might of their armada? But as more and more signals appeared on their sensors, that amusement turned to puzzlement, then to the first stirrings of something the Void Hunters had not felt in centuries. Concern. Admiral Chen stood on the bridge of the Time's Defiant Times as they dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the star system. What she saw made her blood run cold. The Void Hunter fleet was massive, at least 50 ships of various sizes, all surrounding a small civilian vessel like sharks circling a wounded fish. "Admiral," reported her tactical officer, "I'm reading massive energy signatures from the hostile vessels. Their technology appears to be at least 2 generations ahead of our own." "Understood." "What's our fleet strength?" 47 ships have arrived so far, with more incoming. "Mix of military and civilian vessels, ma'am." Sarah nodded grimly. The humans were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had something the Void Hunters had never encountered before. The determination of a species that had earned the right to call itself apex predators on one of the most dangerous worlds in the galaxy. "Open a channel to all human vessels," she commanded. When the channel was established, Sarah's voice carried across the fleet with calm authority. "This is Admiral Chen to all human vessels. We face an enemy that has terrorized the galaxy for 1,000 years. They believe that fear and superior technology make them invincible. Today, we're going to teach them about human stubbornness." A chorus of acknowledgments came back from the fleet. Ship captains, merchant marines, and even civilian pilots, all preparing to face an enemy that had destroyed entire civilizations. "Remember," Sarah continued, "we're not just fighting for those people on that ship. We're fighting to show the galaxy what humanity stands for. We don't abandon the innocent. We don't run from bullies, no matter how big they are. And we sure as hell don't let monsters think they own the stars." On the Time's gentle current asterisk, Captain Zephys watched her instruments in amazement as the human fleet took up attack positions. The creatures that had been systematically hunting down her crew suddenly stopped their advance, as if receiving new orders from their ship commanders. Through her viewports, she could see the Void Hunter vessels turning to face this new threat. For the first time in recorded galactic history, someone had come to fight the unstoppable raiders, and that someone was a species most of the galaxy barely knew existed. The warform aboard her ship spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "What manner of fools are these? Do they not know what we are?" Through the ship's communication system, a human voice responded, calm, measured, and completely unafraid. "We know exactly what you are. You're bullies who prey on the weak, and we're humans from Earth. We eat bullies for breakfast. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of human ships powering up their weapon systems. The galaxy was about to witness something unprecedented. A species willing to face the Void Hunters head-on. Not out of desperation, but out of simple, stubborn principle. The war form clicked its mandibles in confusion. In all their centuries of conquest, they had never encountered a species that seemed eager to fight them. What kind of creatures were these humans? As if in answer to that question, Admiral Chen's voice cut across all frequencies. All units. Weapons free. Let's remind these things that sometimes the prey fights back. The first human plasma volley lit up the darkness of space like a new star being born. The first exchange of fire between the human fleet and the Void Hunters shattered the ancient silence of the Outer Rim. Plasma bolts crossed the void like angry comets, while energy shields flared and sparked under devastating impacts. What should have been a quick massacre turned into something the galaxy had never seen before. A real fight against the unstoppable raiders. Admiral Chen gripped her command chair as the defiant times shuddered under enemy fire. The Void Hunter weapons were indeed more advanced than human technology. But her crew was discovering something important. Superior technology meant nothing if your enemy refused to play by the expected rules. "Damage report," she called out as sparks flew from overloaded consoles. "Forward shields down to 60%, Admiral. But we're giving better than we're getting. The enemy seems confused by our attack patterns." Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. The Void Hunters had terrorized the galaxy for so long that they had become predictable. They expected their enemies to flee or surrender when faced with superior firepower. They had never faced an opponent that responded to being outgunned by getting more aggressive. Signal the fleet. Implement Terran Combat Doctrine 7. The human ship suddenly broke formation, scattering like a school of fish being attacked by predators. But this wasn't a retreat. It was a hunting strategy as old as humanity itself. The ships spread out in all directions, forcing the Void Hunters to split their attention and firepower across multiple targets. The merchant vessel times Iron Will *, commanded by Captain Rodriguez, dove underneath the enemy formation. Her ship wasn't designed for combat, but it was fast and maneuverable. As Void Hunter ships turned to track her movement, she led them directly into the firing line of the heavy cruiser times Unconquered *. "This is Rodriguez to all ships." Her voice crackled across the communication channels. "These things are big and scary, but they turn like pregnant whales. Use that against them." Captain Williams aboard the exploration ship Pioneer Spirit was already putting that advice to work. His vessel danced around a massive Void Hunter dreadnought, staying in its blind spots while peppering it with precision strikes. Every time the enemy ship tried to bring its main guns to bear, Williams was somewhere else, like a mosquito tormenting a giant. But it was aboard the gentle current that the most dramatic changes were taking place. The Void Hunter war form that had been systematically hunting down the Altarian crew found itself facing something it had never encountered before. Active resistance. Dr. Kelvox, the ship's chief xenobiologist, had been hiding in the laboratory when the boarding began. As the war form approached his position, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of cowering in fear, he began analyzing the creature with scientific curiosity. The war form kicked down the laboratory door, expecting to find another terrified victim. Instead, it found a small, blue-scaled being, staring at it with intense interest. "Fascinating," Dr. Kelvox said, apparently oblivious to his imminent death. "Your biology appears to be a hybrid of organic and mechanical components. How do you maintain the interface between synthetic and biological neural pathways?" The war form paused, confused. In thousands of raids, no victim had ever asked it a scientific question. It tilted its head, studying this strange prey that showed no fear. Through the ship's communication system, they could hear the ongoing battle between the humans and the main Void Hunter fleet. The sounds of weapon fire and shouted orders filled the air. But something had changed. The tone wasn't one of desperation anymore. It was the sound of a real fight. Captain Zephys, who had been hiding in an emergency compartment, opened her communication channel to the human fleet. "Human vessels, This is Captain Zephys of the Times, Gentle Current Asterisk. Your intervention has given us hope, but you don't understand what you're fighting. These creatures have destroyed entire civilizations. You should retreat while you still can. Admiral Chen's voice came back immediately, steady and unshakable. Captain Zephys, this is Admiral Chen. With respect, you don't understand what we are. We're from a planet where everything tries to kill you from the moment you're born. We didn't get to the top of our food chain by running away from things that scared us. The Void Hunter war form heard this exchange and felt something it had never experienced before. Uncertainty. Through its neural link with the collective consciousness of its fleet, it could sense the confusion of its commanders. The human ships were not fighting like any enemy they had faced before. Instead of trying to match the Void Hunter's superior firepower directly, the humans were using tactics that seemed almost primitive, but were proving devastatingly effective. They attacked in coordinated swarms, used the environment to their advantage, and showed a level of tactical creativity that the collective had never encountered. The war form activated its communication implant and spoke in the harsh, mechanical language of its kind. These creatures fight like the ancient prey hunters of our home world, but they use metal ships instead of claws and teeth. In the depths of space, the battle was turning into something unprecedented. The Void Hunter fleet, which had entered the engagement expecting an easy victory, found itself locked in brutal combat with opponents who seemed to get more dangerous the more desperate their situation became. The human heavy cruiser Times, unconquered Times, had taken severe damage to its port side. But instead of retreating, Captain Morgan ordered his ship to ram into the nearest Void Hunter vessel. The impact shook both ships, but the humans had prepared for it while the raiders had not. Boarding pods launched from the Times' unconquered Asterisk, carrying human marines into the heart of the enemy ship. Lieutenant Jackson led the first wave of boarders into the alien vessel. The corridors were filled with a thick, organic atmosphere that made breathing difficult. But the Marines pressed forward. They had trained for boarding actions against human pirates and rebels. Fighting alien monsters wasn't that different, except for the part where the monsters had claws and acid blood. "Contact front!" Jackson called out as the first Void Hunter warrior rounded a corner. The creature was massive, nearly filling the corridor with its bulk. But the Marine squad opened fire immediately. Their weapons were designed to stop human opponents. But humans had always been good at adapting their tools for new purposes. The Void Hunter warrior charged through their gunfire, its organic armor absorbing most of the damage. But Jackson had served in the Australian Marine Corps before joining the Space Navy, and he had learned some tricks fighting crocodiles in the Northern Territories. As the creature reached him, he dropped to the ground and rolled, coming up behind it with a plasma torch intended for cutting through bulkheads. The torch sliced through the warrior's leg joint, dropping the massive creature to the deck. The other Marines quickly finished it off, but they could hear more enemies approaching through the ship's twisting corridors. Back aboard the Times' Gentle Current Asterisk, Dr. Kelvox had somehow managed to engage the war form in what could generously be called a conversation. The creature's curiosity about this fearless prey had overcome its immediate desire to kill. "Your species appears to have achieved a remarkable level of biological and technological integration," Kelvox continued his analysis. "But I'm curious about your social structure. Do you maintain individual identity? Or do you share a collective consciousness?" The war form found itself actually answering. "We are one mind with many bodies. Individual thought is inefficient." How fascinating. But if that's true, how do you handle creative problem solving? Individual perspectives often lead to innovative solutions that a group mind might miss. For the first time in its existence, the war form began to question something it had always taken for granted. The collective consciousness had always been presented as superior to individual thought. But these humans, with their chaotic individual minds, were proving remarkably effective in combat. Through the ship's sensors, the war form could see the ongoing battle. The human fleet was actually winning exchanges against Void Hunter ships, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Their unpredictable tactics and willingness to take enormous risks were disrupting carefully planned assault patterns. Admiral Chen watched her tactical display with growing amazement. What had started as a desperate rescue mission was turning into something that would make military historians write new textbooks. The humans weren't just holding their own against the Void Hunters. They were actively pushing them back. "Admiral," her communications officer reported, "we're receiving signals from other human ships throughout the sector. More reinforcements are arriving every hour. Word is spreading through the fleet network about our engagement." Sarah nodded. That was the thing about humans. They had always been tribal creatures. When the tribe was threatened, everyone came running to help, regardless of the personal cost. The exploration vessel times Pioneer Spirit times had managed to disable the engines on a Void Hunter cruiser. Captain Williams opened a channel to the enemy ship, his voice carrying across the void with typical human irreverence. "Attention, Void Hunter vessel. This is Captain Williams of the human ship times Pioneer's Spirit **. You seem to be having some engine trouble. Would you like us to call you a tow truck?" The response came back in perfect standard Galactic, though the voice carried undertones that made it sound like grinding metal. "Humans. You fight well for such a young species, but you do not understand what you have begun. We are eternal. We have consumed 1,000 civilizations. You are nothing but a brief flame that will be extinguished." Williams chuckled. "Yeah, we get that a lot. Thing is, we've been dealing with existential threats since we figured out how to make sharp sticks. You're just another predator. And we've gotten really good at dealing with those." As if to emphasize his point, the Times Pioneer's Spirit Times fired a precise volley that took out the Void Hunter ship's weapons array. The message was clear. The humans weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to win. The war form aboard the Times Gentle Current Times felt the collective consciousness of its fleet wavering for the first time in centuries. These humans were not behaving like prey. They were behaving like apex predators who had found new territory to claim. And for the first time in its existence, the war form began to wonder if the Void Hunters had finally encountered something that might prove to be more dangerous than they were. The tide of battle turned completely when Captain Morrison aboard the science vessel Times, Darwin's Revenge Times, made a discovery that would change everything. His ship's advanced sensors had been analyzing the Void Hunter fleet composition when they detected something extraordinary. "Admiral Chen, this is Morrison. I'm reading massive quantum fluctuations from the largest enemy vessel. It appears to be some kind of command ship with a direct neural link to the entire fleet." Sarah's eyes lit up with understanding. "A hive mind. Take out the queen bee, and the whole swarm falls apart." "Exactly, ma'am. But the ship is heavily shielded and positioned in the center of their formation. Getting close enough to do damage would be suicide." Admiral Chen studied her tactical display, watching the patterns of enemy movement. The Void Hunters were still fighting with their typical brutal efficiency, but she could see something different now. A subtle coordination that suggested central control. If Morrison was right, they had found the enemy's weakness. "All ships. This is Admiral Chen. New priority target. The large vessel at the center of the enemy formation. We're going to punch through their lines and take it out." Captain Rodriguez aboard the Times Iron Will Times was the first to respond. "Admiral, that's a heavily defended position. We'll lose half the fleet trying to break through." "Not if we do it right," Sarah replied. "We're going to use something these creatures have never seen before, a human cavalry charge." The concept was insane by any reasonable military standard. The humans were going to abandon all defensive positioning and throw everything they had at the enemy's strongest point. It was the kind of tactic that could only be conceived by a species that had survived on a death world by being more stubborn than everything that tried to kill them. Aboard the Times Gentle Current **, the conversation between Dr. Kelvox and the warform had taken an unexpected turn. The creature had become genuinely curious about individual consciousness and was asking questions that surprised both of them. "You say that each human thinks independently," the warform said, its mechanical voice showing traces of confusion. "But how do you coordinate your actions? How do you achieve unity of purpose?" Kelvox smiled, forgetting for a moment that he was talking to a creature that had killed most of his crew. "That's the beautiful thing about consciousness. We don't need to think the same thoughts to work toward the same goal. We choose to cooperate because we believe it's right, not because we're forced to. Through the ship's communication system, they could hear Admiral Chen giving orders for the cavalry charge. The human fleet was about to attempt something that violated every principle of space combat tactics. The war form felt a tremor of uncertainty through its connection to the collective mind. The central command ship was reporting something unprecedented. The individual human ships were not just coordinating their attack. They were improvising and adapting in real time. Each captain was making independent decisions that somehow worked together to create a devastating assault pattern. "This is impossible," the war form muttered. "Individual minds cannot achieve such coordination without central control." "Watch and learn," Kelvok said quietly. The human fleet accelerated toward the center of the Void Hunter formation like an ancient cavalry charge across an open field. The merchant vessel times Iron Will times led the way, its civilian captain showing the kind of courage that had carried her species from the caves of Africa to the stars. Behind her, military cruisers and exploration ships flew in loose formation, each captain free to choose their own approach but united in their determination. The Void Hunter defensive fire was devastating. 3 human ships were destroyed in the first minute of the charge, their crews dying in the cold vacuum of space. But the remaining ships pressed on, their return fire growing more accurate as they closed the distance. Captain Williams aboard the Times Pioneer's Spirit Times had his ship dancing between plasma bolts like a leaf in a hurricane. His crew was working with the kind of coordination that could only come from years of shared experience and mutual trust. They weren't connected by a hive mind, but by something potentially stronger. The bonds between individuals who had chosen to stand together. Engineering. "I need everything the engines have got," Williams called out as his ship shook under enemy fire. "Captain, if we push them any harder, we risk a core breach," his chief engineer replied. "Then we better make this count. Helm, take us straight for that command ship. If we're going out, let's make it memorable." The Times Pioneer's Spirit Times burst through the enemy defensive line like a missile, its weapons blazing. Williams had chosen to sacrifice his ship to clear a path for the others, but at the last moment, an opportunity presented itself. The Void Hunter command ship's shields flickered as its power grid struggled to maintain multiple systems under heavy fire. "All power to forward weapons," Williams ordered. "One shot, people. Make it count." The exploration ship's main plasma cannon, designed for asteroid mining, fired a concentrated beam that punched through the command ship's weakened shields and deep into its organic hull. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Throughout the Void Hunter fleet, ships suddenly lost coordination. The collective consciousness that had guided them for millennia flickered and went dark as their central control node was destroyed. Individual war forms found themselves experiencing something they had never known: the terrifying freedom of independent thought. Aboard the Times Gentle Current Asterisk, the war form that had been talking to Dr. Kelvox suddenly staggered as the collective link was severed. For the first time in its existence, it was truly alone with its thoughts. What has happened to us?" it asked, its voice showing genuine confusion and fear. Kelvox watched the creature with scientific fascination and unexpected compassion. "You've become an individual. Welcome to consciousness." It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time. The war form looked at its clawed hands as if seeing them for the first time. Without the collective to guide its actions, it found itself questioning everything it had been taught to believe. We were told that individual thought was weakness. But these humans show strength through their individuality, not despite it. Kelvox finished. Each person choosing to do what's right, rather than being forced to follow orders. Throughout the Void Hunter fleet, similar scenes were playing out. Creatures that had been components of a hive mind were suddenly faced with the reality of personal choice. Some panicked, unable to cope with the freedom. Others, like the warform talking to Kelvox, began to question the assumptions that had guided their species for centuries. Admiral Chen watched in amazement as the enemy fleet began to fall apart. Ships that had been moving in perfect coordination now drifted aimlessly, or even collided with each other. The Void Hunters who had terrorized the galaxy for a millennium were dissolving into chaos. "All ships, cease fire," she ordered. "Let's see what happens next." The silence that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever experienced. For the first time in recorded history, a Void Hunter fleet had been defeated not through superior firepower or technology, but through the simple act of breaking their collective mind and forcing them to think as individuals. Captain Zephys emerged from her hiding place aboard the Time's gentle current Times to find the war form sitting in her ship's corridor, staring at the wall with an expression of profound confusion. Dr. Kelvox was sitting nearby, apparently conducting an impromptu counseling session. The collective always told us what to think, what to do, the war form was saying. Without it, how do we know if our choices are correct? That's the thing about being an individual, Kelvox explained gently. You have to figure it out for yourself. It's harder, but it's also what makes life meaningful. Admiral Chen opened a communication channel to all ships, both human and Void Hunter. This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Navy. The battle is over. Any Void Hunter vessels that wish to surrender will be treated according to the laws of war. Any that wish to leave may do so without further interference. The response came from dozens of different Void Hunter ships, but for the first time in their history, each response was unique. Some requested sanctuary, curious about this thing called individual freedom. Others fled into deep space, unable to cope with the loss of their collective identity. A few tried to restart hostilities, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the human fleet's coordinated response. But it was the war form aboard the Time's gentle current Times that provided the most significant moment. After hours of conversation with Dr. Kelvox, it made a choice that surprised everyone, including itself. I wish to learn more about this individual consciousness, it said. Would it be possible for me to study with your people? Quote. End quote. Quote. Captain Zephys looked at the creature that had killed most of her crew, then at Dr. Kelvox, who nodded encouragingly. The decision she made in that moment would be talked about in diplomatic circles for generations. Dr. Kelvox will be responsible for your education, she said. But you will work to help repair the damage you've done to my ship and crew. The war form, who would eventually choose the name Seeker for itself, agreed immediately. It was the first step toward rehabilitation for an entire species that had been enslaved by their own collective consciousness. News of the battle spread throughout the galaxy at faster-than-light speed. For the first time in 1,000 years, merchant ships began traveling the outer rim routes without fear. The Void Hunters, once the unstoppable terror of space, had been reduced to scattered groups of confused individuals trying to figure out who they wanted to be. Some species celebrated the humans as heroes. Others worried about what it meant that a species barely a century into space travel had defeated an enemy that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia. But everyone agreed on one thing. The galaxy would never be the same again. Admiral Chen stood on the observation deck of the Time's Defiant Asterisk, looking out at the debris field that had once been a Void Hunter fleet. Her tactical officer approached with a report. Admiral, we've received a message from the Galactic Council. They want to meet with you to discuss what happened here. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Humanity had just announced itself as a major power in galactic affairs, whether they had intended to or not. The galaxy would want answers about how a relatively primitive species had accomplished what no one else could. Schedule the meeting, she said. But make sure they understand something. We didn't do this because we're stronger or smarter than anyone else. We did it because it was the right thing to do. And that's not going to change just because we've gotten everyone's attention. As the human fleet began the long journey home, they carried with them more than just the satisfaction of victory. They carried the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles aren't won through superior force, but through the simple act of refusing to accept that some things can't be changed. The distress signal that had called forth the human fleet had done more than save one alien research vessel. It had shown the galaxy that there were still species willing to stand up for those who couldn't protect themselves, regardless of the odds. And in doing so, humanity had taken its first step toward becoming the guardians they never knew the galaxy needed. In the years that followed, the phrase, human cavalry charge, would become synonymous with the kind of desperate courage that turns impossible situations into legendary victories. But for the crew of the Times, gentle current Times, and the former war form now called Seeker, it would always mean something simpler, proof that sometimes, when someone calls for help, people actually come running.